The conflict in Ukraine rages on, with more than 30 people now reported killed after an apartment building was hit over the weekend. Hello, I'm Anand Naidu, and this is The Heat. There is no let-up on the hostilities in Ukraine. Kyiv has accused Russia of a missile strike on an apartment block in Donetsk province on Saturday. A number of civilians were reportedly killed. We will discuss that later, and the latest developments in Ukraine later in the show. But we begin with the Swiss ambassador to the United States. Switzerland, a small country in the heart of Europe, has a history of neutrality that is centuries old. It is not a member of NATO, but still has strong views about the conflict in Ukraine. I sat down recently with Jacques Pitlou, Switzerland's ambassador to the United States. Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Switzerland, of course, is one of the few countries, European countries that is, that does not belong to NATO. What can you tell us about Swiss neutrality?
Well, Swiss neutrality has a very long history dating back to the 16th century, when Switzerland realized that its days as a major military power in Europe were over, and realized that it would be best protected by not meddling into other countries' wars. And neutrality has worked pretty well for us since then. As a matter of fact, one could argue that it really did protect us from most of the major European upheavals in the 18th, 19th, and 20th century.
If we look at the conflict taking place in Ukraine right now, we see that most European countries, of course, that belong to NATO, have responded very forcefully against Russia. They've imposed very harsh sanctions against Russia. At the same time, they've expressed very, very strong support for Ukraine. They've helped Ukraine with weapons as well. What is Switzerland's position regarding this conflict?
Switzerland's position as a member of the United Nations and also as a future member of the Security Council is that we really insist on upholding international law. And there was a clear decision by the General Assembly of the UN, 140 votes to 5, that this constituted a blatant case of aggression, which is against the UN Charter. So in that particular case, Switzerland, together with the other United Nations members, is condemning this as an aggression, which doesn't mean that you're giving up neutrality in the strict legal sense of the term, because neutrality implies that you do not participate in the conflict, even if you condemn morally, because neutrality doesn't mean neutrality of values.
Now, there is mostly unity among the European nations when it comes to this conflict and how they respond to it. But there are some countries in Europe which have expressed disagreements with the broad position of European countries. Take Hungary, for instance, which has criticized the sanctions and says that the European Union should start negotiations, start some kind of way to end this conflict. But what is Switzerland's view?
Well, our view, first of all, is that we shouldn't meddle into the affairs, the internal affairs of the European Union. And this is discussion that is taking place within the European Union, where some member states indeed do disagree, especially with the depth of the sanctions and with the general condemnation of the Russian aggression. From our point of view, of course, the decision whether to ask for peace or to start negotiations is a decision that should be first and foremost taken by the aggrieved party, and that is the Ukraine. So the Ukraine has been the victim of an aggression. It will be for the Ukrainian government to decide whether they want to enter into a negotiation. Are we willing to help? Is Switzerland, as usual, willing to help if asked? Of course we will. Are we going to push anyone to do something? That is not, I think, really compatible with neutrality. So, but of course, should the two parties ask us to help find a negotiating settlement, of course Switzerland would help, but it's their decision, not ours.
That question also becomes very pertinent and very relevant, I guess, because Switzerland, we have seen so many times in the past, has played the role of the honest broker, providing the neutral ground when there are warring parties.
Mm-hmm. True, and Switzerland will certainly go on with offering what we call the good offices. It's really one of the key elements of our foreign policy. We believe in dialogue. We believe that anything but war, is a better solution, and dialogue is a better solution than war. But good offices mean that the parties involved are asking you to play the role of the honest broker. So we are the protecting power of the United States of America in the Islamic Republic of Iran. For a very long time, we were the protecting power of the United States of America in Cuba. We are the protecting power of Georgia in Russia and Russia in Georgia, and this goes on. But it always means that we have been asked by the parties to play that role. We are always open for any help that we could give for a peaceful negotiation and settlement.
And as a diplomat, how important is it for the world to have a country like Switzerland, where parties that have disagreements and in some instances go to war against each other know that they can go to a place like Switzerland or rely on a country like Switzerland to try and get this resolved diplomatically?
Well, I would like to hope that this is really important because it's the stalwart of one of our, one of the main aspects of our foreign policy is that openness and disponibility. I think it's important. Of course, we are not the only ones. Of course, there are other places where people can meet, but generally, what many countries do realize is that we do not have any vested interests or strategic interests. We are too small to have strategic interests in taking party for one or the other side. And in that sense, it makes Switzerland a unique place, also because we are hosting one of the two main seats of the UN, so it gives also the opportunity to network on the spot. And one of the main qualities, I think, of Swiss diplomacy in that particular kind of situation is that we are extremely discreet. We don't leak. Anything that comes out of a process that has been supported by the Swiss government, if something comes out, it's because one of the parties wanted to communicate. We never do.
I want to turn now to Switzerland's role at the United Nations. Switzerland was recently elected as a non-permanent member of the United Nations Security Council. Its term starts in January next year. Tell us about the importance of Switzerland joining that.
One shouldn't overstate a 2 years period of one country joining the Security Council. So many other countries have done it before. But we think it is an interesting opportunity to stress the importance of our vision of what the international order should be about. So we believe that we have a successful track record in peace building and conflict prevention, or also in post-conflict, let's say, reconciliation. And I think, as you mentioned before, that we are considered a credible actor in terms of trying to create a conducive environment for peaceful discussions. We also think, and that's definitely something that we are going to stress during our time in the Security Council, that we have a historical role in protecting civilians, and stressing the importance of international law, and also international humanitarian law has traditionally been something very important for us. We do believe that we have something to say about climate change and addressing climate security and all the problems pertaining to the destruction of the environment, where Switzerland, not a perfect country, of course, but is trying also to reach a number of really interesting goals. And finally, we do believe that there should be at least a discussion about enhancing the effectiveness of the United Nations and of also of the Security Council, fully knowing that probably it's going to be a very, very difficult discussion. It's not easy to change the structures that have been in place since the end of the Second World War.
Ambassador, thanks so much for joining us.
It has been a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
We turn now to the latest developments in Ukraine. There have been more Russian strikes on the country's second largest city of Kharkiv, and an apartment building was also hit over the weekend in the town of Chasiv Yar, killing a number of civilians, or several civilians. Ukraine now saying at least 30 died. Russia has repeatedly insisted it is hitting only military targets. We have this report from John Gambrell.
This apartment block strike in Chasiv Yar in eastern Ukraine is one of the deadliest attacks to hit civilians in recent days. The death toll is so high because the attack came overnight over the weekend when most of those in that building were asleep in their beds. They're still searching for more survivors. They pulled some out alive, but it's a very grim scene there. I do have to say that the Russians have claimed, without offering any evidence, that their strike there actually targeted a base of the Ukrainian territorial defense, and the Russians claim, without offering evidence, that they killed 300 soldiers in that attack. I have to say, though, that Associated Press journalists who have been at the scene of that site have seen no evidence that supports that baseless claim. Meanwhile, in Kharkiv, Ukraine's second largest city in the northeast, there have been a series of attacks there that have also killed civilians. It just goes to show that really right now nowhere in eastern Ukraine is safe for anyone. Meanwhile, the Ukrainians are hoping that they can launch a counteroffensive against the Russians, and that may be focused on Kherson. That's a city in southern Ukraine that the Russians have held for some time. The Ukrainians have taken a village there recently, and there's also partisan activity that have seen railway bridges and other logistical points attacked. The Ukrainians also are receiving more advanced weaponry from the West, including these advanced HIMARS weapon systems, these missiles that are on the back of trucks that the Ukrainians have been able to fire at targets deep inside of Russian-held territory in Ukraine. Meanwhile, we had the Prime Minister of the Netherlands come to Kyiv today. He met with President Zelensky, and he offered his support and said that those Western weapons would continue to flow.
This war may last longer than we all hoped or expected. But that does not mean we can sit back and passively watch how it unfolds. We have to stay focused and continue to support Ukraine in every way. And I again call upon all my colleagues in Europe and elsewhere to provide Ukraine with heavy military equipment. We will continue supplying arms to Ukraine as the Netherlands, including heavy equipment such as armored vehicles and self-propelled howitzers.
Something that the Ukrainians are going to need as they continue to fight. I'm John Gambrell in Lviv with the Associated Press for CGTN.
Let's get to our panel right now. Joining us from Kyiv is Peter Zalmayev. He is director of the Eurasia Democracy Initiative. With us too from Moscow is Viktor Ivanov. He is a lead expert with the policy group, the Center for Actual Politics. And here in Washington, D.C., we are joined by Anton Fedyashin. He is a Russian expert and professor of history at American University. Welcome to all of you. Peter, let me start with you, and let's start with that attack on that apartment building in Chasiv Yar. We now understand that 30 people have been killed there, as you heard from the reporter a moment ago. He was saying that the Russians say that they were targeting Ukrainian military soldiers there, but they've provided no evidence for that. What else can you tell us about this attack?
Well, I mean, it's part of a pattern, despite the, the evidence that we have from, including British intelligence, that Russia is really hit, is in an operational pause before it resumes its attack in the Donbass. While it's true of its ground troops, of its some of its weaponry, the shelling of towns and cities in Donbass continues, and the fact that a lot of these hit residential areas and kill a lot of people speaks to the fact that Russia is probably running out of its precision weaponry, and it's increasingly relying on its Soviet-era stock of very crude weapons. In many cases, they're banned under UN conventions, and this is part of a pattern. What we saw in Chasiv Yar, we're seeing throughout Ukraine from the beginning of the war. And let me just say, by contrast, what Ukraine is doing now, we're just seeing these reports in the last couple of hours. It hit yet another weapons stockpile in one of the towns in the south of Ukraine, the Kherson region. Ukraine has not, followed that same pattern that Russia has. It's relying on, Western supplied weaponry, including HIMARS from the United States, which allow it to target very precisely military objects in occupied territories.
Viktor Olovich, is Russia running short of precision weapons right now and using older weapons that may not be as accurate as more modern weapons?
Well, Russia has not run out of precision-guided weapons. At this point, Russia is using a combination of various weapon systems. It's important to remind the viewers that the Ukrainian army has attacked that city of Donetsk for years. And in fact, even since this special military operation began on February 24th, several hundred people have died, several hundred civilians have died in Donetsk under Ukrainian missile strikes and artillery strikes. So when we talk about civilian infrastructure damage or civilian casualties, we have to talk about that on both sides. Russia is not purposefully targeting civilians on the Ukrainian side. But when we take into account the scale of military action, it is almost impossible to have military action on this scale without casualties, without civilian casualties on either side. So this is not just something that is happening on one side. And unfortunately, the longer this military conflict drags on, the more civilian casualties and other casualties there will be.
Viktor, I take your point there. Russia has, in fact, repeatedly denied targeting civilians in this conflict. But how does one explain an apartment building being hit?
Well, how does one explain the Chinese embassy being hit in Belgrade during the American and NATO war on Serbia and Yugoslavia in 1999? How does one explain medical factory, pharmaceutical factory being hit in Sudan in the 1990s by US forces? Of course, when there's military action, some strikes don't reach their targets. This happens on all sides.
Anton Fedyoshin, just a few days ago, Russian President Vladimir Putin, he said that Russia, in his words, has barely started its campaign in Ukraine. In fact, he dared the West to defeat Russia. I mean, what do we read into those comments? What are the Russian intentions here?
Well, I think this is bluster for the most part on Putin's part, but it does have a purpose, and it does have a modicum of reality behind it, because it's worth remembering that the Russians are fighting on a peacetime footing. They have not mobilized their population. They are fighting in Ukraine with their standing army. And so Ukraine's gone through, 3 waves of mobilization now. So the two sides are, not equally matched in terms of the manpower that they have mobilized. He may have been referring to that. He's also, of course, implying that the Russians still have both the manpower and the technological capabilities to continue this war even further. And judging by the economic fallout that the sanctions have brought in the West, not just in Russia, of course, but also in the West, time for now seems to be on the Russian side.
Anton, it may be bluster, but do these comments by the Russian president indicate that this is not a conflict that's going to end anytime soon?
They may. Look, the Russians and the Ukrainians had been in talks until March, when, because of the events surrounding or that happened in Bucha, the Ukrainian side suspended those talks. And so for now, everything is in abeyance. There are no direct talks going on, at least not ones that we know of, although it's not out of the question that behind closed doors there are contacts. But the Russians seem to be ready to talk. And Putin, in the same speech, also, remember, mentioned that the longer this conflict continues, the more difficult it will be to reach a mutually acceptable, which means, essentially mutually unacceptable, but a ceasefire and a peace deal.
Peter, I want to move now to another consequence of this conflict, and these are the food shortages that we are seeing in many parts of the world. Turkey's President Recep Tayyip Erdogan, he's been holding talks with both the Ukrainian President Zelensky as well as the Russian President Vladimir Putin on efforts to try and get Ukraine grain exports moving. We know that Ukraine has stored much of its harvest in silos in the country. There are tens of millions of tons that are being stored there. Do you know if any progress is being made? Could Erdogan actually get this moving?
Well, we're certainly hoping that he can. And, we were encouraged when, a couple of weeks ago, the Russians, after they blatantly stole Ukrainian grain, they tried to export it and bring it to Turkey. And that's when Ukraine complained and Turkey arrested the ship. And that was obviously the right thing to do. Russia is trying to look elsewhere to find those willing to buy stolen grain. Turkey is in a unique position as a country that enjoys good relations with both sides, with Russia, with Ukraine, and once again, it's unique in that position. And so, if anyone can do it, it's probably Turkey. But once again, don't be fooled thinking that Vladimir Putin will go along with this scheme. I'm very doubtful on this because he's using grain shortages and the looming hunger in many countries and potentially millions of fatalities from this as a way to pressure Ukraine, as a way to pressure Western partners of Ukraine, to pressure in turn Ukraine to bring it to a negotiating table on or under Russia's conditions. The same thing is being done with gas, as you know. Nordstream pipeline, Nord Stream 1, is now under maintenance, and for 10 days Germany will not receive any gas on that pipeline, and it's very concerned right now. Vladimir Putin cannot see any longer any clear path to a military victory in Ukraine, and so he's resorting to all these tactics of blackmail we're seeing.
Viktor, what do you make of what you just heard there? Is President Putin using food shortages to pressure Ukraine, and what can you tell us about the fact that there is now maintenance being conducted on the Nord Stream pipeline?
Well, first of all, it was Russia, together with Germany, that was interested in Nord Stream 2 being taken, being functional. And it was the West, it was the United States and the German government that decided to block that. It was Russia that was interested in stable gas and oil supply being sent to its European partners. And it was the EU states and some of their allies in Europe and outside of it that said that that they want to get rid of Russia's oil and gas imports as soon as possible, because they do not want to be dependent on Russia for that. So, but when Russia shuts down Nord Stream 1 for maintenance for quite a short time, the Europeans cry foul. Well, which is it? Does Europe want to get rid of its influence on Russian gas and oil, or does Europe want Russia to continue sending its oil and gas to Europe while Europe is waging a full-scale economic war on Russia? It can't work like that. One can't impose massive sanctions that are designed to stifle a nation's economy and expect that nation to abide by every economic treaty and every economic contract that it has signed in the years past. Simply cannot work like that.
What about
now, as far as grain deliveries?
Yeah, Viktor, what about the accusations that
Russia, of course, is interested.
Yeah,
right.
What about the
now,
accusations?
as far as grain, the grain market?
Yeah. What about
Russia is not interested in Middle Eastern nations or African nations experiencing any economic woes or food shortages because of what is going on in Ukraine. Russia is obviously interested in its partners around the world being able to feed their populations and not experience any extra issues or problems. But at the same time, Russia, of course, is interested in controlling naval vessel movements to Ukrainian ports. It is the Ukrainian authorities that mined the shipping lanes around Ukrainian ports to prevent the Russian Navy from coming too close to the Ukrainian ports in the Black Sea. So it is up to, first of all, it is up to the Ukrainian authorities to get those mines out. And second of all, it is up to the Ukrainian authorities to agree to have any ships that would deliver grain to be checked by Russian authorities so that there would be no weapons deliveries on those ships.
Viktor, Anton Fedyashin, a UN Development Program report says that an estimated 50 million people have fallen into poverty since the conflict started. You have countries like Somalia, impoverished countries, that are heavily dependent on grain coming out of Ukraine. How much devastation can this cause, especially in developing countries around the world?
Massive devastation. But remember that the same UN report also noted that the problem that has now become more acute, that the war in Ukraine has made even worse, actually began before the conflict started. And it has to do with a set of climatic conditions and droughts, particularly all over the world. India, for example, for a time suspended exports of grains because of the situation inside of the country. Indonesia, by the way, has done the same thing. This is not exclusively the creation of the conflict in Ukraine, but it certainly has contributed to it, which is why the sooner that there is a peace, or the sooner that there is an agreement, at least, about the export of goods, cultural, the better for everyone.
Okay, and that's where we have to leave it. Thanks to all of you for being with us. You've been watching The Heat. I'm Anand Naidu in Washington, D.C. Thanks for being with us.
Each day, there are millions of stories. Each one can open new perspectives, new possibilities. Wherever you look, we are there to see, discover, explore. We put the pieces together to find what really matters to you, all around the world, all around the clock. Our reporters are at home across the globe. From our headquarters in Beijing and production centers in Washington, Nairobi, and London, China Global Television Network. Stories from across the globe, reaching people across the globe. CGTN. See the difference.